Land. It's one of the most valuable commodities on planet Earth. And in America, the right to own private property is considered almost a sacred right, a right guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States. To own land, to have it, to enjoy it, to use it without encroachment from the bureaucracies of government. There is a very rapid and not a very subtle shift going on in America today, and that is the confiscation of lands of all types, from farms, homes, lakeshore property, rivers, brooks, little streams, wetlands, are all being targeted by county, state, federal, and international government sources. This is a plat book of Dunn County, and you'll see it says State of Wisconsin, Department of Natural Resources, own vast amounts of Wisconsin. This is just the state of Wisconsin that you're looking at. They own literally thousands upon thousands of acres in Wisconsin. The DNRs are operative in this manner all over the United States. They are presently in the process of trying to get approval to buy up land, farms all over with public funds. And of course, this puts the citizen having to bid against a government. The war is on, folks. The proposed calls for the DNR to purchase active farmland for sale near already owned state properties. Land would be placed in open space agriculture with conservation deed restrictions. Farms then would be sold back into farm production, and of course they would have all these conservation deed restrictions. Well, this is just a backdoor approach to total control over the farmer and the rights to use land. Private property does you no good if you can't use it. The program would allow DNR staff to improve wildlife habitats around these properties and guarantee that they would be used in the manner theoretically set aside for by the government decrees. The Red Cedar River Basin project is a new holistic big picture approach to water quality planning, a partnership between the DNR and the UW Extension with early input from the public. She explained the information and goal setting portion of the project is funded by the Federal Environmental Protection Agency grant. A lot of these local projects are actually funded on the federal level, and this is all part of the UN biodiversity plan to steal the United States of America. The new approach to water quality planning reflects increasing criticism that existing soil and water conservation funding is not being spent as wisely as it could be, said Paul Laberty, I guess, a DNR water resources engineer. The Rice Lake Group also listed the cost to improvement of water quality, a need for consistent water quality standards, residential septic systems, adequate enforcement of existing zoning regulations, upstream concerns, and storm sewer runoff. The Menominee Group ranked protect shoreline and scenic values of rivers and lakes among their concerns. The ecology is coming up rapidly. Wallop listed the Fish and Wildlife Service for acts with regard to ESA enforcement. This war is going on all over the United States, and it is a war, folks, and it's a war between a private landowner and a government that has begun to run wild. Last week it was the Fish and Wildlife Service, which Wallop charged is putting out anonymous information to intimidate landowners into acquiescing to development restrictions in connection with the Endangered Species Act. This is one of the most harmful and dangerous acts ever enacted when it comes to private property. The U.S. Supreme Court has agreed to hear a lawsuit between Oregon ranching farming interests and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service questioning current Endangered Species Act recovery practices which restrict plaintiffs from withdrawing water for their purposes. If the plaintiffs win, It would be a key in strengthening the rights of farmers and ranchers across the nation in appealing endangered species recoveries, which unfairly restrict agricultural use of land and related resources, a plaintiff's spokesman said. Missouri livestock organizations protest environmental proposals. This is a war that you're watching, a real war. Hundreds of agricultural supporters met in Missouri State Capitol February 28 to voice their opposition to environmental legislation under consideration by the state's legislative proposals and committees. This is a very, very dangerous trend we are watching. Protesters said current proposals may impose heavy restrictions on agriculture and livestock industries, which would lead to a continued decline of the family farm and burdensome compliance costs for large corporations. That's exactly what they wanted. That's what they want.
Ozone is an invisible upper atmospheric gas that protects all forms of life on Earth from most of the sun's damaging radiation. Radiation that can cause skin cancer, eye damage, and suppression of the immune system. The harvesting of fish and plant life are also affected. A vast amount of aquatic life has its beginnings in the oceans near Antarctica. False color imagery of the South Pole from NASA's Nimbus 7 satellite provides scientists with a roadmap of daily changes in the ozone. By tracking this imagery for the past 9 years, they have discovered a trend. Each spring over Antarctica, a hole in the ozone develops, and it has been getting larger year by year. To date, as much as 50 to 60% of the ozone in this area has been lost. These discoveries prompted a coordinated series of Antarctic ozone experiments. Last fall, an international effort, including some 150 scientists and engineers from NASA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, National Science Foundation, and industry, worked together for 4 months to study this alarming environmental issue. Scientists used ground-based instruments and launched balloon-borne payloads to sample air chemistry at McMurdo Station in Antarctica. At the same time, NASA's DC-8 flying laboratory studied the lower atmosphere, making long missions from Punta Arenas, Chile, into the area of ozone depletion. NASA's high-flying ER-2 plane, carrying a single pilot and a handful of sampling instruments, flew directly into a layer of atmosphere where the ozone was depleted. A number of activities contributing to ozone loss have been pinpointed by the scientific and policy community. No longer do canned aerosol products contain chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, but these harmful gases still get into the atmosphere because they are used as refrigerants, fire retardants, foam-blowing agents, and solvents. As long as this persists, ozone will continue to be lost. Initial findings from the summer's ozone expedition verify that there is a complex interplay between CFCs, chlorine-containing gases, and the meteorology in certain parts of the world. Ice crystals in the upper atmosphere convert the gases into a byproduct that destroys ozone. These ice crystals usually only form in the atmosphere of the South Pole because it gets so cold. This may explain why other parts of the world aren't dramatically affected by the depletion. Scientists still do not understand all the mechanisms of change, but thanks to the work of so many, we will soon have a more complete understanding of ozone loss and its threat to the world environment. In the early 1990s, a new generation of atmospheric satellites will probe even further into the problem.
The special danger he faces today is not overturning, but pollution. Pollution was always something we saw close up, or not at all, until the National Aeronautics and Space Administration gave us a global view from high above. Pictures the spacecraft send back to waiting scientists have greatly expanded our knowledge of pollution, how much there is, where it is, what's causing it, and how we can combat it. A star performer among satellites, Landsat every day snaps hundreds of electronic pictures. It takes 3 images at a time in separate frequency bands. When combined in special ways, composites of these photos reveal startling new looks at the Earth. The pictures roll out of the processing lab in a never-ending stream and provide vital information to researchers all over the United States and around the world. Aboard NASA's orbiting workshop called Skylab, a team of astronaut scientists point their special cameras and instruments at the sun, probing for insights into new energy sources. But the vast array of sophisticated equipment is primarily focused on the Earth, to discover new ways of understanding some of our problems. Tom McEwen reminds us of the way things used to be. A solitary figure on waters that once were crowded with people. On how many lakes and rivers have we lost the chance to enjoy simple pleasures our grandfathers knew? 100 years ago, smokestacks were a proud symbol of industrial progress. They meant jobs for the people, products in the stores. Refuse from a plant was a local problem, disfiguring only one tiny bit of land, water, or air. It seemed a small price to pay for more jobs, higher salaries, a rapidly improved standard of living. Scum in the river, but a chicken in the pot every Sunday. A stench in the air, but a car in the garage. Pollution grew around us, slowly at first, then more and more rapidly, until one day, at last, we stepped out of our comfortable air-conditioned, television-equipped homes and noticed that something had gone wrong with our once pretty world. Pollution was no longer a local problem. Out of the rapids now, and gliding gently with the currents, Tom seems to have passed safely through the most challenging part of his afternoon adventure. Yet, in fact, he's now exposed to a far greater danger than the rapids. Here, where the river's pollution is at its most virulent, overturning could bring ear infection, dysentery, hepatitis. The truth about the river is nowhere so clearly revealed as in a NASA satellite photograph. The most highly polluted areas show in light blue. By adding artificial colors to different photo images of the same scene, researchers have learned how to unlock a fantastic array of earthly secrets. Weather, rangeland, ice and snow, patterns of silt in a river. A fairyland of unearthly colors, packed with messages for the knowing observer. Oil spills and algae blooms, stream erosion and strip mining, smoke clouds and smog. A satellite photo taken on that Thanksgiving Day. Examining it later, scientists would discover an event never before observed, visible only from a platform in space. Industrial plants along the shore of the lake, smoke from the factories carried by the wind across the lake. Clouds, storm clouds, formed not by nature, but artificially by the smoke. And somewhere down there, below those clouds, Jacob Heath is on his way home.
And that's the community calendar for today. Here's an important change in our local weather forecast. For counties east of the lake, cloudy this afternoon, turning much colder. Heavy snowfall likely to begin before sunset. Local officials say Snow Emergency Plan 2 will be in effect for the metropolitan area.
The afternoon is wearing on, and Jimmy and his father have only one fish to show so far. Not much, but enough to please a young assistant fisherman on his first time out.
Hey, on the shore, don't eat that fish. We just got word that may be poisoned. Hey, don't eat that fish. That may be poisoned.
Poison. The fish may be poisoned. Men who have grown up fishing in these waters are stunned by the news. To Jimmy and the other boys, it's bewildering. How could it have happened? An artificial color photo from a NASA satellite reveals what is invisible to the naked eye. Offshore is a dumping ground for acid waste, but one toxic load has been accidentally dumped much closer to the coastline. Now tides are carrying it toward the shore. Alerted by the satellite information, officials now know they must keep a close check on the threat to swimmers and fishermen. Tom McEwen has not escaped the hazard that surrounded him. He has brought his kayak safely through the white water, even though pollution still remains a constant threat in the Potomac River. even as it passes the historic shrines of Washington, D.C. Jacob Heath tries to stay calm as he faces a storm caused by pollution. Never before had this been so directly observed. On the basis of the satellite pictures, the companies will be ordered to stop pollution from their smokestacks. In this way, satellites are providing more accurate and reliable weather information by helping to stop inadvertent weather modification. Can satellites help point the way towards solving the problems of pollution? Besides revealing a portrait of the Earth, NASA spacecraft have also been gazing outward toward the sun. Here is a vast, inexhaustible source of energy. If we could find ways, practical ways, to tap the sun's power, we could end much of the pollution that comes from fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. This precious planet, this Earth, our only home. Through careless decades, we have sullied it. Just in time, the satellite now gives us a view of pollution impossible to get in any other way. One day, we will again swim in the Potomac, breathe clean air, live in harmony with the land. Until then, the satellites of NASA will be at work, providing information to deal with the pollution below.
Its objective was to determine accurately and realistically the nature of the problems that would confront the United States if and when a condition of permanent peace would arrive. The visible military function of war requires no elucidation. It is not only obvious but also irrelevant to a transition to the condition of peace, which it will be by definition superfluous. It is also subsidiary in social significance to the implied non-military functions of war. Those critical to transition can be summarized in 5 principal groupings. Summary and conclusions. Economic. War has provided both ancient and modern societies with a dependable system for stabilizing and controlling national economies. No alternative method of control has yet been tested in a complex modern economy that has shown itself remotely comparable in scope or in effectiveness. 2, political. The permanent possibility of war is the foundation for stable government. It supplies the basis for general acceptance of political authority. It has enabled societies to maintain necessary class distinctions, and it has ensured the subordination of the citizens to the state by virtue of the residual war powers inherent in the concept of nationhood. No modern political ruling group has successfully controlled its constituency after failing to sustain the continuing credibility of an external threat of war. Sociological. War, through the medium of military institutions, has uniquely served societies throughout the course of known history as an indispensable controller of dangerous social dissidents and destructive antisocial tendencies. As the most formidable of threats to life itself, and as the only one susceptible to mitigation by social organization alone, it has played another equally fundamental role. The war system has provided the machinery through which the motivational forces governing human behavior have been translated into binding social allegiance. It has thus ensured the degree of social cohesion necessary to the viability of nations. No other institution or group of institutions in modern societies has successfully served these functions. Ecological. War has been the principal evolutionary device for maintaining a satisfactory ecological balance between gross human population and supplies available for its survival. It is unique to the human species, cultural and scientific. War orientation has determined the basic standards of value in the creative arts. It has provided the fundamental emotional source of scientific and technological progress. We have already pointed out that the end of war means the end of national sovereignty, and thus the end of nationhood as we know it today, says Iron Mountain. This report from Iron Mountain, although claimed to be a fraud, has some definite statements it makes. The war system makes stable government of societies possible. It does this by providing an external necessity or threat for society to accept political rule. And so doing, it establishes the basis for nationhood. War then equals nations. Peace equals the end of nations. Peace means merging the nations into a global governmental structure, a supranational government. A number of proposals have been made governing the relations between nations after total disarmament. They contemplate institutions more or less like the World Court or a United Nations, but vested with real authority. If societies need an external threat to force them to accept political rule in the nation-state system, then what form of global threat will be needed to force them to accept a global United Nations rule? The existence of an accepted external menace, then, is essential to social cohesiveness as well as to the acceptance of political authority, says Iron Mountain. So they have to come up with an external menace. This menace must be believable. It must be of a magnitude consistent with the complexity of the society threatened, in this case global, and it must appear at least to affect the entire society. Credibility, in fact, lies at the heart of the problem of developing a political substitute for war. It is more probable, in our judgment, that such a threat will have to be invented rather than developed from unknown conditions, says Iron Mountain. Such substitute institutions and hypotheses must meet varying criteria. In general, they must be technically feasible, politically acceptable, and potentially credible to the members of the societies that adopt them. An acceptable economic surrogate for the war system will require the expenditure of resources for completely non-productive purposes at a level comparable to that of military expenditures otherwise demanded by the size and complexity of the society. Such a substitute system of apparent waste must be of a nature that will permit it to remain independent of the normal supply-demand economy. It must be subject to arbitrary political control. So as you phase down the military, you bring in this other system and spend just as much money on it. A viable political substitute for war must posit a generalized external menace to each society of a nature and degree sufficient to require the organization and acceptance of political authority. Sociological, first, in the permanent absence of war, new institutions must be developed that will effectively control the socially destructive segments of society. Second, for purposes of adapting the physical and psychological dynamics of human behavior to the needs of social organization, a credible substitute for war must generate an omnipresent and readily understood fear of personal destruction. This fear must be of a nature and degree sufficient to ensure adherence to society values to the full extent that they are acknowledged to transcend the value of individual human life. Ecological. A substitute for war in its function as a uniquely human system of population control must ensure the survival, if not necessarily the improvement, of the species in terms of its relation to environmental supply. Cultural and scientific, a surrogate for the function of war, as a determinant of cultural values, must establish a basis of social or moral conflict of equally compelling force and scope. A substitute motivational basis for the quest for scientific knowledge must be similarly informed by a comparable sense of internal necessity. The premise then is that war equals nation, so no war then equals global government, because war holds all the nations together. We must then find substitute for the external threat of war in the economic, political, sociological, cultural, and scientific fields. The following substitute institutions, among others, have been proposed for consideration as replacements for the non-military functions of war. That they may not have been originally set forth for that purpose does not preclude or invalidate their possible application here, says Iron Mountain. That Iron Mountain's recommendations were feasible, acceptable, and credible is proven by their adoption and popularity among the world's citizens, and that includes a great majority of Americans who do not really understand what is happening to them. Economic. A comprehensive social welfare program directed toward maximum improvement of the general conditions of human life. B, a giant open-end space research program aimed at unreachable targets. And C, a permanent, ritualized, ultra-elaborate disarmament inspection system and variants of such a system. And of course, we've watched those come into place. Sociological control function, programs generally derived from the Peace Corps model. And B, a modern, sophisticated form of slavery. Motivational functions: intensified environmental pollution, new religions or other mythologies, socially orientated blood games, or combination forms of all of the above. Ecological, a comprehensive program of applied eugenics. Cultural, no replacement institutions offered. Scientific, the secondary requirements of the space research, social welfare, and/or eugenics programs. However unlikely some of the possible alternative enemies we have mentioned may seem, we must emphasize that one must be found of credible quality and magnitude if a transition to peace is to ever come about without social disintegration. Well, we're going to look at two major Iron Mountain substitutes for the war threat: massive global environmental pollution, and two, new religions or other mythologies. These two dovetail into each other and form the very root and basis of the environmental green movement and why your properties are being confiscated at a massive rate. Under political, massive global environmental pollution, and B, new religions or other mythologies. These two substitutes for the war system are now being implemented on a global basis. At the same time the United Nations is coming to full power. They are the root of why Americans are losing their property rights.
Ecology, the balance of nature, is important to all life. One of the tools we can use to monitor this balance of nature on Earth is the satellite. Satellites can be used to observe our planet from a high vantage point. A NASA film called Remote Possibilities tells the story.
From far out in space, the Earth appears serene and beautiful, displaying no hint of our crowded planet's many problems. As we have used and changed our planet, we have become aware that in many ways we are exhausting it. exhausting our food supplies, our sources of energy, our natural lands, exhausting the potential of even the once seemingly limitless oceans. Management of Earth resources is at a critical stage. It has never been more important that we understand the environmental relationships of our planet. Scientists are striving to apply the technology of the space age, the quest for more and better information about these complex relationships. In 1972, a new kind of satellite left the launch pad and rose to an altitude of 910 kilometers from Earth. There it settled in a circular orbit around the planet. This satellite, called Landsat, opened a new era of Earth resource management. Landsat's images are providing new sources of information about many different kinds of Earth resources. The satellite is being used to map the extent of flood damage. Landsat's before and after images make excellent maps to study how fast water recedes and damaged land recovers. Landsat is keeping track of land development. For example, how well areas damaged by strip mining are being reclaimed. Scientists are using Landsat to map remote areas as possible wildlife habitats. To search the Earth's surface for clues to new mineral deposits. To inventory the world's agricultural crops so that food and fiber resources can be better managed. Future geography books will use Landsat images to show the world as it really is. This map, made of 569 separate Landsat images, carefully pieced together, gives a dramatic view of the United States never before available. Perhaps it is Landsat's beautiful views of the Earth which remind us most of all that the Earth is a treasure.
It may be, for instance, that gross pollution of the environment can eventually replace the possibility of mass destructions by nuclear weapons as the principal apparent threat to the survival of the species. Now remember, it's just the principal apparent threat. Ecology is to be made the principal threat. To accomplish that, we must first invent a global ecological crisis. The ozone hole, global warming, endangered species, a new ice age, the red tide, urban blight, overpopulation, pesticides, water pollution, overgrazing, deforestation, acid rain. In short, the world is headed for a total disaster. All facets of the controlled media will be brought in to convince the people of the world that a crisis has come that threatens the very existence of life on Earth. Real problems will be magnified totally out of proportion to bring about this staged and invented crisis. Why were the pollution problems and environmental hazards allowed to develop to the point that the media could use them to prove to the world the crisis was real? It is true, says Iron Mountain, that the rate of pollution could be increased selectively for this purpose. In fact, the mere modifying of existing programs for the deterrence of pollution could speed up the process enough to make the threat credible much sooner. Poisoning of the air and of the principal sources of food and water supply is already well advanced. That was in 1966. At first glance would seem promising. In this respect, it constitutes a threat that can be dealt with only through social organization and political power. But from present indications, it will be a generation to a generation and a half before environmental pollution, however severe, will be sufficiently menacing on a global scale to offer a basis of solution. Translation: don't enforce any pollution laws until 1985 and beyond, so that the threat is menacing enough to be able to justify a United Nations global intervention and force the world into global government. The elite then come forward with their Save the Earth proposals, develop a new ethics and a new world religion based upon the divinity of nature. This is done by funding from major socialist foundations who set up the green organizations and think tanks to bring forward the Iron Mountain ecology agenda, and it will take many years. At the same time, these foundations bring forward their one world government concepts, and bit by bit they put into place by a method called piecemeal functionalism. It's another word for how the Fabian socialists work. It means gradualism, very, very slowly over a long period of time. Can we prove that the rulers desire a one world government? Norman Cousins worked for world peace and world government. Strobe Tabbitt's lifetime achievements as a voice for global harmony have earned him this recognition. He will be a worthy recipient of the Norman Cousins Global Governance Award. Best wishes for future success, President William Clinton. In the booklet Secret Records Revealed by Dennis Cuddy, who is a doctor in research, he does a tremendous amount of research into the money and the methods behind the New World Order. In the aftermath of World War II, President Truman wanted to empower the United Nations to create a New World Order. Richard Gardner proposes that 40 to 50 member nations contribute to a rapid deployment force of 100,000 volunteers that could train under common leadership. It is time for us to create such a force. The existence of such a force could go a long way towards making the New World Order more than just a slogan. U.S. Senator David Boren, the world needs an ally on call. And Presidential Directive 1325 actually placed the American military under the UN. We have a much bigger objective. We've got to look at the long run, and that's what they're doing. They're looking at the long run of things. President Bush, Desert Storm, was to bring in a new world order. He told it to the American people, and he told it to the United Nations that that's what the Gulf War was all about. General Eisenhower is working for an allied army under a single flag, uniform, and command to defend Western Europe. Senators reported today on the return from an overseas global trip. It is undeniable that the centuries-old doctrine of absolute and exclusive sovereignty no longer stands. Underlying the rights of the individual and the rights of people is a dimension of universal sovereignty that resides in all humanity. It is a sense that increasingly finds expression in the gradual expansion of international law. In this setting, the significance of the United Nations should be evident and be accepted. Secretary General Boutros Ghali. It is a legitimate American national objective to see removed from all nations, including the United States, the right to use substantial military force to pursue their own interests. Since this residual right is the root of national sovereignty and the basis for the existence of any international arena of power, it is therefore an American interest to see the end to nationhood as it has been historically defined. Walt Rostow. That's exactly right out of Iron Mountain. That's what Iron Mountain says. almost word for word. Freedom from war, the United States program for disarmament, disbanding of all national armed forces, and the prohibition of their reestablishment in any form whatsoever other than those required to preserve internal order and contributions to the United Nations Peace Force. Where no state would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN Peace Force. There you have it, folks, right out of the horse's mouths. They want to set up a new world order, and the environmental system is part of it. The assault upon the Constitution of the United States by globalist forces through the United Nations, NGOs, and foundations. NGOs, or non-governmental organizations, are going to play a very important part in this thing. Essential things to remember: the Constitution was framed to limit government, and the rights of the people came from God himself. They are not granted by the government. All the rights rest in the people. In the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course, part of this is also property rights, and God even allows property rights. Charter of the United Nations, however, is totally different. Under the United Nations Charter, God is not recognized at all. The government grants all the rights, and therefore government can revoke all rights and can thus enslave you by revocation of whatever rights they say. And the communists have been noted for that. Their whole thing is controlling people, enslaving people. The United Nations Charter is a communist document, and it was actually made in the image of the Soviet Union's Constitution. They grant all kinds of rights, but then they turn right around and say they may be revoked or limited by law. For example, everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. That right shall include freedom to have or to adopt a religion or belief of his choice, and freedom individually or in community with others, and in public or in private, to manifest his religion or belief in worship, observance, practice, and teaching. Freedom to manifest one's religion or beliefs are subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law and are necessary. And of course, they totally can revoke all the rules. So, interpretation: we, the United Nations, shall grant you the rights you want, but we shall rescind them all unless we approve of it. And they never approve. The United Nations is evil, and its intents are evil. In spite of everything it says, the record speaks for itself. And Jesus Christ told you to look at the fruits. When the United Nations comes to power, all the freedoms spoken of shall be removed. They are a ploy and a deception to get the world to give them absolute power and to give them the weapons of war so they can control the earth. Another ploy often used by the socialist communists is to grant all kinds of rights, but then insert the phrase, except in cases of emergency. In the new state's constitution, which is essentially a socialist communist document, the term emergency is used throughout the document. Notice it says, except in declared emergency. Practice of religion under the new constitutions is going to be privileged. It's a privilege, so they can take it away. Property shall be taken without compensation. In Section 12 says no property shall be taken without compensation. The word just is left out, meaning they can take your ranch, farm, home, lands, or anything by paying you $1, which is compensation. In fact, that concept is already well entrenched in the green movement and we have the records to prove it. This concept of taking your lands, farms, home, and ranches without just compensation is part of the government strategy and the ecology movement. It is a totally socialist, communist concept, and of course totally violates the Constitution of the United States. The attack upon our Constitution, which guarantees our rights to private land ownership and property and to be free from unreasonable search and seizures, is being made through the ecology crisis. This is how they're doing it. The attack upon the Fourth Amendment rights is increasing at an alarming rate, and if the American people do not take immediate legal steps to halt it, their property rights will be gone forever, and they will have in fact sold their own children into eternal slavery. And Amendment 2, well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, and the second area of attack is upon the Second Amendment. The socialists have to disarm the American people so they cannot resist by force the implementation of the New World Order or the implementation of the biodiversity treaties and the removals from their lands, their farms, and their homes. It is more probable in our judgment, said Iron Mountain, that such a threat, ecologically speaking, in this case, will have to be invented. That's what the Green Movement says. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea of pollution. The threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. All these dangers are caused by human intervention. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself. Club of Rome, and the Club of Rome is a socialist UN organization. We must make rescue of the environment, said Al Gore, the central organizing principle for world civilization. This attack upon America and all of her people is done via what is known as crisis management. And it works like this. It's very clever. You allow a known pollution and ecological problems to grow, or whatever the emergency is you wish to implement. Then you implement the planned media coverage of problems to bring it to a crisis stage. Then you introduce a solution to the crisis when the people say, we've got to solve this, we've got to do something. We need global government to take control over the lands, resources, and the environment. The UN is here now, and why not give it to the UN? At the same time, you introduce the new ethic. Private property owners are the primary cause of the problems, therefore eliminate private property rights, and you also bring in the worship of the earth. You elevate it to a high level. This concept has worked over many years and conditions both the unknowing general public and the youth to bring about the desired change. Do not underestimate the danger our American Republic is facing. We stand a 90% chance as of the present time of losing America. Some would even say that it's a certainty we've already lost. Note, sustainable development is in reality at the root of it a code word for total environmental controls. Now this comes from a UN document, Preparatory Committee for the United Nations Conference on Human Settlements called Habitat 2. First session was in Geneva, April 1994. It's a draft statement of principles and commitments. Now remember, this is an official United Nations document. The Vancouver Declaration on Human Settlements, Land, Agenda Item 10D, the preamble. Land cannot be treated as an ordinary asset controlled by individuals. Private land ownership is also a principal instrument of the accumulation and concentration of wealth, and therefore contributes to social injustice. Total socialism, folks. Social justice, urban renewal and development, the provision of decent dwellings and healthy conditions for the people can only be achieved if land is used in the interests of society as a whole. This is pure communistic public control of land is indispensable to its protection as an asset and the achievement of long-term objectives of human settlement policies and practices. Remember that the objectives in reality are in land use control and forced relocation into what is known as all use zones in the Wildlands Project and under the Biodiversity Treaty. Land is a natural resource fundamental to the economic, social, and political development of peoples, and therefore governments must maintain full jurisdiction and exercise full sovereignty over such land. In other words, the people have no rights whatsoever for land. The government must have all the rights. Agricultural land is an important national resource. Without public control, land is a prey to speculation and urban encroachment. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a clear attack upon American principles and how we started this country. The unearned increment profit resulting from the rise of land value must be subject to appropriate recapture by public bodies, the levying of appropriate taxes, land taxes, betterment charges, taxes on unused or underutilized land, such as your forests, mountains, hills, lowlands, and wetlands. In other words, they intend to tax you off your property if they can't get it any other way. Pure socialism, where the government ends up in total control and the people have nothing. Many countries are undergoing a process of profound social transformation. A review and restructuring of the entire system of ownership rights is, in a majority of cases, essential to the accomplishment of new national objectives. Redefinition of legal ownership, clear definition of public objectives, transitional arrangements to change land ownership from traditional land and customary patterns to new systems. And those new systems are very easily understood. The government owns it all. The new system is communist and socialism, and the United Nations is a CFR communist front to take America in a way least expected. And if you don't believe it's a communist organization, dig into the congressional records, because they held hearings on it. The rich men, Council on Foreign Relations, set up foundations who set up and financed non-government organizations, NGOs, to purchase land in the name of ecology and use them as think tanks to produce agendas to carry out the objectives of the Biodiversity Treaty. This is how they actually are setting it up. And these foundations are from very wealthy people. These NGOs are buying up millions of acres in the name of saving the environment. They operate right beside the government agencies at all levels that are likewise buying up or confiscating millions of acres of private land. This is all part of the Wildlands Project, the chief agenda adopted by the United Nations for the taking of America, and for that matter, the entire world. The green movement is huge, and don't let anybody tell you it isn't. Literally billions of dollars is being poured into this project. It's saturating the media at all levels. In the environmental source book, for example, Friends of the Earth, look at their revenues, over $3 million. This is a very, very small operation. In reality, expenditures were $2.9 million. Greenpeace USA, revenues, $33 million. Expenditures, $31 million. Look at the membership, 2,350,000 people are in just Greenpeace. League of Conservation Voters, Bruce Babbitt, president. They only had revenues of $1 million, but look who is the president of it. And they track the members of Congress in their votes on the environmental issues. And they publish these papers to vote out of office anybody that does not go along with the Secretary of Interior's viewpoints and the Green Movement viewpoints. It seems to us that that's a conflict of interest, but that's the way it goes these days. Natural Resources Defense Council, revenue $17 million, expenditures over $17 million, had 170,000 in their membership. This is not some small, isolated thing. And here are some of your foundations: Richard King Mellon, John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur, the Pew Charitable Trust, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, David and Lucille Packard Foundation, W. Alton Jones Foundation, W.K. Kellogg Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Literally millions and millions and millions of dollars is going in to this thing. They mean business. This is not something that's not real. The Ford Foundation was brought before a congressional hearing that was probing foundations and what their goal was. We operate here under the directives which shall emulate from the White House. The substance of those directives is that we should use our grant-making power to alter life in the United States so that we can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union. Now that means exactly what it says. Change the foundations of this country and bring us into a socialistic state. The United Nations is a CFR-controlled socialist organization. It was set up, actually, by the Council on Foreign Relations, and if you read their documents, they claim that they want America to go under the United Nations. The Foundation's goal is to really accomplish that fact. The Council on Foreign Relations is the American branch of a society which originated in England and believes national boundaries should be obliterated and one world rule established, and of course that one world rule is to be under the United Nations. That's what they've done it for. Now look at what the World Bank is doing, investing literally millions upon millions or billions of dollars are going to be poured into this thing, probably in reality trillions before this is done. Bankers are not noted for their charity. They do not loan billions for a project unless there's something in it for them. There is total control over the world's land, resources, food, and people. Bankers seldom speak of the environment without mentioning debt. If the banks do the loaning, who holds the lands and who has the debt? In their charity, the bankers would foreclose on unpaid national debts by taking the land in a debt-for-nature swap. They could collapse the economies of the world via the derivative market so that no nation could repay its massive debt and thus come in with their new offer. We will take the lands and natural resources to satisfy the debt. They're already doing this in third world countries, and they're going to do it to the United States of America. These huge holdings are then placed in what is called the World Conservation Bank, which the bankers own and set up, so they in turn can refinance the entire global village under new terms, new agreements, and a whole new system of finance called social credits. Social credits is a new system that is cashless and operates under a computer debit system. All citizens will be required to have a smart ID card that contains all the information about that individual. It serves also as a debit card. Instead of dollars, goods are priced in credits. And eventually, this is planned to move into a mark system where this is put into your hand and scanned.
I was uniquely suited to understand the conspiracy, and I will use the word conspiracy. That is, people whispering together in a covert connection to do some dirty work against the United States and against Jesus Christ and against his people, as we will hear this evening. I was uniquely suited because I have taught accounting at a college level. I have taught business management at a college level. I have 25 years of business experience, and for the last 19 years, I have been engaged as an entrepreneur of my own business called Medical Resources in going into businesses, analyzing their businesses, and seeing what is wrong with them, and being able to take all of these variables that I see in this business and come out with conclusions that are correct for their business to save their business. In other words, I'm a business doctor. So when I heard the undertones and the nuances and the double entendres that were going on in the speeches at this Congress, I knew that there was a conspiracy where others might have just had the words pass over their head. Something here that was not true, because conservation is an antipathy with growth and development. They are mutually exclusive, as we have learned. Then when I saw the world bankers at the Congress and the UN Undersecretary Generals and the Secretary General, who I had dinner with one night, and the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and the secretaries of the Treasury and so on, I said to myself, why are they suddenly interested in conservation? The world bankers are the ones that have destroyed the rainforest down in Brazil. If you look at the history of the World Bank under Robert S. McNamara, he's the one that designed the Vietnam War. He left the Vietnam War in 1967 and went over to World Bankdom, where he became the president. He set up massive loans that were given without the permission of the American people. There was a token rubber stamp for these massive loans to go out of our world banking system into the hands of Brazil and Mexico and the Latin America countries, and we don't know really how those monies were spent. One project that the monies were spent on in Brazil was a large highway connecting the inner parts of Brazil with the coast, and that highway still does not function properly, from what I understand, because it was designed poorly, and it floods when the rains come, and so it's not dependable. Billions of money were spent on that. Billions were spent on dams that don't work. Rainforests were slashed down and ruined, and our oxygen generating areas of the world were decimated by the very people that were saying that they wanted to save our ecology, save our biospheres, and keep the world safe.
Did you receive advance information about who the dignitaries were that would be present?
No. I had no idea that those dignitaries were going to be there. All I knew was there were going to be people representing the interests of reindeer and the Arctic, where I wanted to get my son a job. When I got there, the first night, I was invited to the opening party that they had, and I noticed one of the name tags waiting for someone to pick it up was Eddie Rothschild. And I said, Rothschild? I wonder if the Rothschilds are here. And then that's when I checked the materials that were given to me, the registration packet, which contained booklets like this. This is our common future, by the way, according to the world elite, the people that are going to control the one world religion coming out of this, the one world banking system, the one world government, also have in mind that our common future is like these poor Ethiopians who have been turned against by their very own government. So they passed out these booklets. These are the lands that we're going to be losing to this bank. But you know, as of this meeting, that there's no value in wilderness lands. And you also know at this meeting that there is no earnings engine in the World Conservation Bank. In other words, it is a fraudulent bank. Remember when Esau said to Jacob, I'm really hungry and I want some of that pottage that you have there. And Jacob said, will you give me your birthright for it? And that was the first known swap. That was a counter-trade transaction. And through counter-trade, Rothschild and his bevy of bankers are going to debt swap and counter-trade the United States, every one of us, every city, every town, every state, every bit of wealth is going to be counter-traded out of the country into the Royal Bank of Canada, which is the collection basin for the American swapping activities. They're going to come along and say, you can't pay your mortgage and you're down on your knees and you're going to lose your farm. Here, take a World Conservation Bank loan. 5 years before the first payment, and the payments are low and it's only 3% interest, and you'll be helping Mother Earth. And that's another aspect of this thing. There's going to be a religious pride thing. Hitler came along touting the Fatherland. Well, we're going to hear something even bigger than that. These guys are going to sell this World Conservation Bank as something that is helping Gaia, Mother Earth, because there's a Mother Earth religious cult coming out of this thing too. Yes, the World Conservation Bank is going to be the decoupling mechanism for the wealthy to disengage themselves from capitalism and go to the back of the bank, so to speak, and become the creditors of the bank and then wind up as the world's dictators. Next thing we're going to listen to is Baron Edmund de Rothschild. Well, this is going to be called the new Magna Carta, too, this World Bank program. All these enactments are going to be given the title of the new Magna Carta. In the old Magna Carta, it gave baronial rights, land rights, to barons in England. And in the new Magna Carta, it's going to be given baronial land rights to the world for Baron Edmund de Rothschild. We're going to hear him now announce the creation of the International World Conservation Bank enactments, which will include a second Marshall Plan. That's what's going to bail us out here in the United States. It's going to include a third world debt relief, and it's going to include a new world currency system. Let's hear Baron Edmund de Rothschild.
But perhaps this conference might like to think more about the Marshall Plan, which had been mooted and put forward very tentatively at the Denver conference. And perhaps this might be the keynote of what you have heard today and what perhaps you might like in some perhaps amended form to have put forward. At this conference, recognizing the needs to protect our ecological and environmental heritage within the concept of the World Wilderness Congress, World Wildlife Fund, and all other bodies involved in the preservation of life on our planet, asked the Prime Minister of Norway, Right Honorable the Gro Harlem Brundtland, as one of the world's leaders of a greatly respected community, to be the promoter of this International Conservation Bank. By her Brookland report, which has been widely circulated to world leaders, she could follow up this report with the recommendations to promote a second Marshall Plan, the third world debt relief, and finance for a stable development.
That's it, folks. Those three pronouncements have set in motion a one-world economic system, with the United Nations becoming the legislative Congress, the Royal Bank of Canada being the banker, the Federal Reserve of the world, and the dictators of the world being that hub of people in London. London is the creator of the ills of mankind, I have learned, and the Commonwealth countries are the ones that have done us in.
The methodology of theft, biodiversity treaty, and the wetlands project, or wildlands project rather, in 1995, President Clinton sent to Congress the biodiversity treaty that came out of the UN Rio Earth Summit for ratification. Along with that treaty was a letter of transmittal and a group of annexes. Included were 9 pages of UN objectives. The objectives reflect back to the 1972 5-step agenda for controlling the world's land via the environmental external threat of Iron Mountain. The treaty itself is rather deceptive because it's just a treaty document 10320, and it is the annexes and the objectives that prove the real intent behind the UN rise to power. If you write to your senator or congressman, ask for TD 10320 and the annexes that go with it, particularly the objectives. Objective 1, to make nature the central organizing principle, develop a federal policy that accounts for ecology or ecological values equally with economic values. Objective 2, to establish a legal regime that will utilize international treaties to control all policies from the international level to the national and local levels. The New World Order must unite us all in a global partnership which recognizes the transcendent sovereignty of nature. That's really essentially a return to natural law, and you will hear that occasionally from our congressional leaders and executive portions of the government. Objective 3, to make the use of natural resources a cost. Sustainability can only be achieved through major changes in the system of incentives and penalties. Objective 4, to promote the precautionary principle that scientific evidence is not necessary to implement radical environmental policies. This means that any and all environmental policies can be enacted for any reason whatsoever, and they don't need scientific proof to do it. They just can do it. Objective 5, to inventory natural and human resources. This is officially being done in Babbitt's Office of Natural Biological Survey, which is to catalog every species of plant and animal, which of course includes the human beings, because we are now a human resource. Objective 6, to make man equal to all other species. All ecosystem management activities should consider human beings as a biological resource. That's in the Bureau of Land Management, internal working document on ecosystem management. It goes along with this to make man equal to all other species. This is what Hitler did. Objective 7, to classify people as the enemy. The astounding success of the human species, its proliferation in numbers, and its scale and intensity of its activities is threatening the future of the Earth's life systems. This is the forerunner to a mass human killing. Objectives 6 and 7 are parallel to Hitler's Nazi Germany operations and were used as justification for mass extermination of those classified as undesirable or unfit. The environmental movement and the international bankers have an obsession with massive population rollback reductions. These objectives gives the UN the justification for the mass slaughter of misfits, which is surely coming, particularly so because the Bible mentions this mass slaughter towards the end. Objective 8, to create areas devoid of human presence. Now the word create does not mean to maintain existing areas, but rather to create them out of presently populated areas. That's part of the Wildlands Project, which means massive relocation. Objective 9, to make nature worship a state religion. Respect, preserve, and maintain knowledge, innovations, and practices of indigenous and local communities, embodying traditional lifestyles relevant for conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity, and to promote their wider application. Now, indigenous peoples refers to the original people on any given area of the globe, and the original people over the globe worship Mother Nature. They worship Mother Earth and nature as a god or a goddess. And of course, this is a direct attack by Christian, Islamic, and Jewish religions. And that's essentially what this is. It's an attack upon the basic three religions. Global Diversity Assessment Section number 10. This is a summary prepared by Dr. Kaufman and his group. Agriculture. Agriculture occupies more than 1/3 of the world's land areas and is the leading cause of habitat destruction on a global basis. Current agriculture is not sustainable. So that means that agriculture is going to come under complete control. Protected areas are defined by the Convention on Biological Diversity as geographically defined area which is designated or regulated and managed to achieve specific conservation practices. Biotic movement in a fragmented landscape requires movements between individual fragments. Corridors or native vegetation linking fragments are commonly seen as a solution to this. Corridors thus act as an additional habitat and as representatives of the native ecosystem in their own right. You're going to hear a lot about protected zones, corridors, buffer zones. This means that representative areas of all major ecosystems in a region need to be reserved, that blocks should be as large as possible, and that buffer zones should be established. Blocks should be as large as possible. They mean to take thousands of acres. Buffer zones should be established around core areas, and that corridors should connect these areas. This basic design is central to the recently proposed Wildlands Project in the United States. And of course, this is the Biodiversity Treaty statement itself. So they have adopted the Wildlands Project in the Biodiversity Treaty. Many areas are already extensively fragmented. In this case, retroactive action is required, which involves the protection of existing fragments and the enhancement. The only solution to extensively fragmented landscapes is the large-scale restoration as a whole rather than at the scale of individual fragments. This involves treatment of the non-conservation sectors of the landscape and modification of production practices so that conservation issues are considered. They mean to take the whole thing. Landscape restoration is the big item. During the initial stages of park and reserve establishment, There may be a transitional phase while local inhabitants are provided with options for relocation outside of the area. In many cases, this phase can be 20 to 50 years where residents are given life tenancy. They take away the ownership, give you tenancy, and then close it all down. So your children will never see their homes or be able to own farms or ranches. This is a total and complete opposite of the American way of doing things. One option for dealing with the obstacle of human populations is the creation of extractive reserves and indigenous reserves. Both types provide human inhabitants with limited rights of resource use under certain conditions. These include low population densities, low consumption levels, use of low-impact technologies, limited contact with outside markets, and a relative absence of uncontrolled external demographic, political, social, and economic pressures that would rapidly upset existing cultural and social structures. Total isolation. National legislation gives states police powers to control human activities in a general interest. The concept of process or activities which are potentially damaging to biodiversity and which must therefore be regulated and managed has only begun to emerge. See, they're going to base this on potentials, and that's why they say they do not have to scientifically prove it. They can seize all the land on the basis, well, it might happen. Within these areas, most activities are prohibited or restricted to ensure the long-lasting conservation of the ecosystems concerned. The integrity of a protected area may be achieved through public ownership or regulatory measures. State or land-holding agencies, that's NGOs, folks, may prohibit or restrict activities by third parties on its land and carry out necessary management measures. Further legislation is necessary to dedicate public lands exclusively to conservation, to bind government agencies to respect the integrity of the areas. Legislation should facilitate land acquisition for conservation purposes by the government by instituting a right of preemption over land coming on the market, a right of compulsory purchase, and tax incentives for vendors. However, exclusive reliance on the public purchase of land for protected areas, as happens in several countries, has a disadvantage of being expensive. That's why they don't want to have to buy it from you. They want to take it, and they're going to try and find ways to do that. Biodiversity is defined as diversity within species, between species and ecosystems. Parties must promote the conservation of ecosystems, natural habitats, and the maintenance of viable populations of species in their natural surroundings. The Convention requires the creation of systems of protected areas. Parties must enact legislation for the protection of threatened species and populations. Parties must adapt national strategies, plans, or programs for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. They are also required to prepare environmental assessments of proposed projects likely to have a significant adverse impacts on diversity, and to ensure that the environmental consequences of programs and policies likely to have such impacts are taken into account. Compliance with treaty obligations is enhanced by NGOs, which can point out deficiencies in implementation. So you see, this is a real deep process they're into. Legislation is essential to confer jurisdiction and powers on public bodies and local communities for conservation, establish and enforce procedures, permit NGOs or other organizations to sue, provide incentives for conservation and disincentives to destruction, provide a legal basis for conservation contracts and management agreements. They go on, and they want legislation to be able to seize total and complete control. This basic design is central to the Wildlands Project. We propose nothing less than a rewilding of North America, nothing less than a renegotiation of the human covenant with the land. This new vision has a detailed plan for scientifically based wilderness recovery networks for the entire continent. In so doing, we will set a new agenda for conservation in North America. We will reframe the conservation debate in terms of the continuation of the evolutionary processes and the flourishing of all Native American. This is a big, big project. The Wildlands Project is coming together at the grassroots conservation activists and conservation biologists in a time of crisis. You see, there's your crisis again. This has been magnified, like Iron Mountain said you had to do, as a crisis. We at the Wildlands Project are tired of campaigning for mere slowing of the rate of destruction of national diversity. We will no longer accept the status quo. What we seek is nothing less than the full flowering of the natural biological diversity of North America. We welcome all those who share this audacious vision and passion. Dave Foreman. He was one of the founders, actually, of the Wildlands concept. The meaning of wilderness in the Wildlands Project, in contrast, calls for reserves established to protect wild habitat, biodiversity, ecological integrity, ecological services, and evolutionary processes. That is, vast, interconnected areas of true wilderness. Extensive areas of native vegetation and various successional stages off limits to human exploitation. Viable, self-reproducing, genetically diverse populations of all native plant and animal species, including large predators. Diversity at the genetic species ecosystem and landscape levels is fundamental to the integrity of nature. They intend to set up huge areas, vast landscapes without roads, dams, motorized vehicles, power lines, overflights, or other artifacts of civilization, where evolutionary and ecological processes that represent 4 billion years of Earth wisdom can continue. Vast landscapes, that means digging up roads, digging up dams, destroying homes. Present reserves, parks, wilderness refuges exist as discrete islands of nature in a sea of human-modified landscapes. Building upon these natural areas, we seek to develop a system of large wild core reserves where biodiversity and ecological processes dominate. Core reserves would be linked by biological corridors to allow for the natural dispersal of wide-ranging species, for genetic exchanges between populations, and for more migration of organisms in response to climate change. Buffers would be established around core reserves and corridors to protect their integrity from disruptive human activities. Only human activity compatible with protection of the core reserves and corridors would be allowed. I hope you understand what that really means, because this is deadly. Vast land areas. Land use planning has to occur at the regional level, and you have to participate in this. It's not something optional. The restoration of the wildlands network will depend on the knowledge of people intimate with the mountains, canyons, forests, coves, rivers, and creeks. And guess who that is, folks? Over time, each regional planning group will develop a map-based program for their bioregion. Later, representatives of the bioregional groups will meet and integrate their plans into a national, then continental strategy. And the word continental there, they're talking about bioregion number 1, because the bioregions have already been set up by the United Nations, and the United States is in bioregion number 1. Each regional planning group will develop a map-based program for their bioregion. We have those maps. We're going to show them to you. The use of the term region or regional are United Nations terms for the restructuring of the entire planet. Chapter 8, Regional Arrangements, Article 52. Nothing in the present charter precludes the existence of regional arrangements or agencies for dealing with such matters relating to the maintenance of international peace and security, and that goes on. But basically what it says is that the United Nations has divided the world up into regions, and they use regional areas, those areas being biosphere reserves. The Club of Rome divided the United States up into 10 bioregions, and there they are. And the United States, as you can see, is number 1, as is Canada. Now, these may fluctuate on boundaries a little bit. New York Times in April 21st, 1935 divided the United States up into 9 regions, wrote up a big article about dissolving the states and going into regions. Executive Order 11647, Federal Regional Councils. Presidents of the United States have already divided up through FEMA and other agencies the United States into these 10 regions in compliance with the UN requirements. Federal Regional Councils, there is hereby established a Federal Regional Council for each of the 10 standard regions. Every president, here's 112, 149, same thing. They divide the United States up into 10 regions. Department of Interior, the Department of Agriculture, and the Environmental Protection Agency are the key agencies that we're looking at in this video on the environment, and they operate on a regional basis. Here's a map of the United States showing the 10 federal regions. Now, this has been going on for a long time, and many states are actually not even putting in their state boundaries in anticipation of dissolving themselves into these regions or new states, as the one of the proposed constitutions suggests. The United States is changing rapidly, and it's not a good change. Essentially, what they mean to do when they say vast areas is they start with a core reserve in the center. Then you will notice around the core reserves and the corridor is an inner buffer. Now, in this particular picture, they have 2 core reserves by a corridor, and then they have an inner buffer, and then they have an outer buffer, and that whole thing constitutes a matrix. And then they have what they call inter-regional corridors as we go from region to region. And so they've already planned this out insofar as the United States is concerned under the UN rules and regulations. They're not asking anybody, they're flat doing it. Now, that is how it would look if you had core reserves, and then you have your buffer zones filling out to the matrix, and then they have inter-regional sections. This is not to scale or anything, it's just to show you how it works. Actually, the size is not as shown. The sizes vary from region to region. But the thing to remember is that they eventually, this is what they say, eventually a wilderness network would dominate a region, and thus it would constitute the matrix. I hope you understand what that means. It means we start with the core reserves, remove all the people from it first, and then expand through the buffer zones to the outer matrix boundary. That means they're not taking 50% of the land in the United States. They're taking upwards to 80 to 90% of the land in the United States. They start simply with the core reserves. They go then to the inner buffer. They start pushing out that way and removing all the people. And then they go to the outer buffer. And they remove all the people from that. And the people are removed to what they call little tiny islands of all use zones. These all use zones that they plan are little tiny areas where they will allow human habitation. It's very, very interesting how they have this set up. It's primarily for the control of people. Connectivity, a fundamental principle for designing regional reserve systems, is connectivity. Unless many millions of acres in size, individual core reserves will not be able to function alone as whole ecosystems, you see, in the sense of maintaining viable populations of large animals and ecological systems. They want huge, huge areas. Habitat fragmentation, one of the greatest of all threats to biodiversity, is a process where large blocks of natural habitat are broken up into smaller and isolated pieces. Connectivity is in many respects the opposite of fragmentation. A reserve system with high connectivity is one where individual reserves are functionally united into a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. Now you can understand what they're talking about when they talk about expanding out to the outer limits of the matrix. Linkages as habitat. Some types of corridors are distinct in natural landscape, riparian corridors being a good example. Wide protected corridors are basically extensions of core reserves. The width of corridor needed to maintain an adequate amount of forest interior habitat and minimize edge effects is uncertain and depends on habitat quality both within and outside the corridor. They openly admit they don't even know what they're doing, and that's why they inserted this little thing that they don't need any scientific evidence to bring these radical environmental changes in. Speaking about the size, listen to this. Grizzly bear populations in Canada would require about 12.1 million acres, wolverines about 10.4 million acres, wolves 5 million acres, and for a minimum viable population of 1,000, the figure would be 242 million acres for grizzly bears, 200 million acres for wolverines, 100 million acres for wolves. And of course they say it is not prudent to manage down to these minimums. Such immense areas could not be contained today within individual reserves, but only within regional and interregional systems of interlocking reserves. In other words, they would lock the Greater Yellowstone system to the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem and on to the Canadian Rockies, and the Florida network would link up to the Appalachian Trail all the way to Maine. And this is just the beginning. Look at what they plan to do to Florida. And actually, if you go into their maps, this is not really true. They expect, in their maps on Florida, to take 90% of Florida and set it aside as non-human use zones if you actually get in and study what they're talking about, moving everybody out until they get to the matrix system itself. All in the name, of course, of preservation of the environment, and that's why they had to classify human beings as the enemy. You see, we are the enemy of planet Earth, and therefore this sets the stage for mass elimination of people under the Global 2000. Core reserves surrounded by adequate buffer zones and are well interconnected by corridors could be quite small and still function effectively for most target species. But this is something they do not plan to do if you get into their overall program. They mean to shut down vast portions of it, for example, of the entire western states. Northern Idaho, northwestern Montana are completely eliminated from human habitation if you look at their maps and what they actually wish to do. And they are on the way of doing it. This is not a joke, folks. This is real. Core reserves should be managed as roadless areas. All roads should be permanently closed. They even mean to dig up the roads. The more roads remain open, the less viable the reserve for many sensitive species. Restoration will be the management emphasis in most cases. This is particularly true when a core reserve encompasses a cluster of relatively pristine sites in a matrix of human disturbed habitat. So in other words, we just get rid of the humans. Overview. Local and regional reserve systems linked to others ultimately tie the North American continent into a single biodiversity reserve, in contrast to the present fragmented system of quasi-natural museum pieces in existing national parks, wildlife refuges, wilderness areas, and other reserves. They have all this mapped out. They know exactly what they're doing, and they're going to do it gradually through the Biodiversity Treaty, which is actually now still before the Senate for ratification. They've tabled it temporarily, but it's going to be back, and if the American people don't do something about it, it's going to be passed. If you will notice what it does to northern Idaho and Montana here, this is just one, but the entire northern panhandle of Idaho is shut down. It's actually a core reserve. And when they get done with this whole thing, that whole region will be depopulated of all people. That's what they plan. This thing is serious. They're not fooling around with this thing at all. It may seem like it's ridiculous, but the Bible indicates that the United States of America is to be depopulated. You'll find that in Jeremiah's prophecies against the United States. The man to really contact on this thing, if you really want to know what's going on, is Michael Kaufman, Environmental Perspectives, Inc., 1229 Broadway, Suite 313, Bangor, Maine. He has done a tremendous amount of research on this project, and he is the one who has made these maps available, which actually shows you. He went before Congress and actually got the Biodiversity Treaty tabled. He wrote Saviors of the Earth and Environmentalism, the Dawn of Aquarius, of the Twilight of a New Dark Age. And we suggest that everybody contact him and help support him, because he has actually saved America temporarily from this biodiversity treaty. Here are some of the maps that he has prepared showing you what is actually going to occur if this thing goes through, and we believe it will go through. The red indicates reserves and corridors with no human use at all, human buffer zones, severely limited use, and remember what they said about the buffer zones, bringing it all the way to the matrix, and then the green areas are normal use. So for all practical purposes, the red and yellow areas, look at what it does to North Dakota. Now we superimposed a road map here to show you how many towns, how many road systems are actually going to be shut down. It'll come in just a minute, but just take a look. They have actually taken out almost all of North Dakota, virtually eliminated it from human habitation. Look at the towns and roads that have to be dug up and destroyed to satisfy the requirements of the Biodiversity Treaty, if this wildlands project is actually allowed to come to pass. And it can come to pass through executive order, emergency. They can do virtually now whatever they want to do. This is a forerunner, though, of what's coming. And as we have shown you, the actual documentation for it, this is no joke. This is real. They intend to grab virtually all of North Dakota. Minneapolis, St. Paul is down in a little green area here for Minnesota. Look at what they do to the northern part of Minnesota. They virtually shut it down and will vacate it. Now, if you superimpose a road map on there, look at the roads, towns, and thousands of people that would be forced to move out of those areas totally as they shut these areas down. Is this what you want for your children? If not, you better get active, and you better get active real fast. Get hold of your congressmen, get hold of your senators, get hold of your state people, and make sure they understand where you sit if they vote for this anti-American, anti-constitutional biodiversity treaty and put us into it. It's a hideous, evil treaty. It has nothing to do with the American concept of conservation as we have known it. By and large, the American people that live in the rural areas do a very good job of land maintenance. I personally was on a watershed board in Minnesota, and all the farmers took very good care of their property. Very few exceptions to it. South Dakota, they virtually robbed the entire area of South Dakota as well. It's very, very interesting what's going on here when you analyze the land and analyze the crop grounds. They're using the environment. Look at what they do to Florida. And this is just part of it. Look at what happens to Missoula, Idaho. It's tremendously seizing of property and the moving of literally hundreds of thousands of people off from their homesteads, places they've owned all of their lives. This thing is real. This is not made up. This is what they plan to do. You've seen the documents. And there's something else going on here with this land grab, and it is grabbing the best of the food ground where we raise our crops. They not only will have control of the land, they're going to have control over the food. And that is a communist type operation. They're noted for starving out people. They did it in the Soviet Union. Look at what it does to northern Idaho. It shuts it permanently down. And look at Montana and Washington on either side. This is no joke. This is real. And folks, you better wake up and you better get active with your congressmen and your senators in both state and federal levels, or you're going to lose everything. There's no way out of this thing. It's gone almost too far now.
Well, these biodiversity maps that I have been looking at here are maps of areas in which, in some cases, they will not be allowed to do anything anymore, and most of those are bordering almost every river of consequence in the country. And the thing that they will do, based on what I see in North South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, that's by and large the wheat belt of the United States. And these maps show that they will control something in excess of about 75% of all land in those states. Therefore, if you don't meet their regulations, you won't be doing anything. If you're looking at southern Minnesota and down into Iowa and to eastern South Dakota, eastern Nebraska, and eastern Kansas, the bulk of that land will also be under their control. And that's separated by, if you look at, for example, southern Minnesota, the core of the best land in Minnesota is right in the area that they want to control. And the same happens in eastern Nebraska, and it happens in eastern Kansas as well. Those areas do produce a lot of corn, and if they control that, they'll have a good handle on what happens with our corn supply. The breadbasket of this country is in the Midwest. It's been called the breadbasket for as long as I can remember. And that would include the states of North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Minnesota, certainly Illinois, and a good part of Missouri, getting over into Ohio. These maps show, and I don't really quite understand this, in that it's showing Illinois, Ohio, and Indiana with a much larger proportion of land that will probably be allowed to be used as ag land. But that doesn't account for, when you look at, Iowa has for many years been considered the corn state. Even though Nebraska likes to claim it because they call themselves the Nebraska Cornhuskers. But Iowa has had some of the best land this country has got to offer. Iowa has a fair chunk of normal use. However, that some of the buffer zone and non-use that's indicated here falls in some of the best land they got in Iowa. basically the north half of the state of Iowa is the best land they have, and when you get past Des Moines going south, you're getting into some rougher, rolly land, and some of it is outright cow country when you get down there. So that's not crop production per se. That's more into the livestock industry. Some of these areas that are depicted by the coloration in these maps, I see no reason why they need to be regulated at all. And then the Red River Valley is sure a prime example of that. And then when you get further into the Dakotas, for example, they allow apparently normal use, and that land is not as desirable if you were to follow prices on what farmers will pay for land, and you went up there, you'd find the Red River Valley land is far the most expensive land up there.
Robert Mueller, Undersecretary General of the United Nations, wrote a book called New Genesis, Shaping of a Global Spirituality. This dives right to the heart of the new religion that they plan to bring in. We must now pass from the national to the planetary age and from the rational to the moral and spiritual age. We must reinsert ourselves in the total visions of the great religions and prophets. Science must take its appropriate place in these greater visions, which alone can provide satisfactory answers to the mysteries of life, of the universe, and of human relations. The world's major religions must speed up dramatically their ecumenical movement and recognize the unity of their objectives in the diversity of their cults. And of course, this is one of the things that Jesus Christ warned about in Bible prophecy, that in the end they would reject the truth of Christianity and come together in one unified worldwide religion. Now must dawn a worldwide era of supreme reverence for life, embodied in a universal, peaceful, nonviolent, disarmed, just society as heralded by all great religious leaders. Now, of course, that's not true. Jesus Christ said that that was the Antichrist system. It's done without Jesus Christ. We must work out the rules of world harmony between all peoples. A Project newsletter says a central premise underlying the decade-long strategies of Project Global 2000 is that the creation of an equitable and sustainable common future is, at its heart, ethical and a spiritual matter. Such a future requires a world ethic that can provide a foundation for radical changes in prevailing value systems and a deepening awareness of the sacred source of all life and the integral relationship between the human species and the whole Earth community. This is the coming together, you see, of all the great religions of the world, which is what Jesus said would happen.
million people. If we expand that particular concept in the upper Midwest, for instance, to all of the tributaries of the Mississippi River and in the minor rivers, then you're up to about 52 million people that are being impacted by having federal jurisdiction along these major river corridors. Mm-hmm. And that then you can begin to convert federal and public lands into these corridors and reserves. And then finally, up in the upper right-hand corner, you can begin to see this process. And let me just zero in on that with this one. And this would be an example of what could happen in the upper Midwest.
Right here in Minnesota.
Where, and this only shows about 30% of the area in red. And they're asking for 50%.
I see.
It's astonishing what they are really, really all about and trying to do.
Amazing.
And it's not just confined, as we saw with the World Heritage Convention, that treaty, to the Convention on Biological Diversity. This is taken from an internal EPA working document in 1993 that basically says that we need to fulfill the United States' existing international obligations, in other words, the Convention on Biological Diversity. We hadn't ratified the treaty yet, and the EPA is already implementing the provisions of the treaty without it ever being ratified.
I'm almost dumbfounded.
You're almost dumbfounded. And finally, when you look at what the President's Council on Sustainable Development, this is only 6 out of 16 goals that were published in a draft version in March of 1995, where it calls for a network of conservation areas. That sound familiar?
Yeah.
The realignment of social and economic and market forces using both incentives and disincentives, the full accounting of natural resource stocks, identical to the United Nations Global Biodiversity Assessment that's coming out of the President's Council on Sustainable Development.
Yeah, using all the same words.
Using all the same words and phrases. Talks about bioregions and the fact that we must establish regional cooperation and governance.
Interesting.
Every single point that's in this treaty is in the President's Council on Sustainable Development.
Well, it sounds like this is the reason Clinton was made our president then, doesn't it?
Yes.
Kind of?
Yeah, I think so. In fact, I would suspect that this is the heart of what they talked about in reinventing our government.
Yeah, yeah.
A year or so ago. Now, Inside EPA, which is a magazine that's published monthly, the April 28, 1995 issue quoted several of the council members on the President's Council on Sustainable Development, and they basically acknowledged that this is so radical that it has very little chance of being implemented. What they didn't say is it's already being implemented.
Oh.
And the fact that we have one of them basically saying that if I am a conservative Republican on Capitol Hill, this is red meat for me to say that the Clinton administration is practicing social engineering. That is an understatement. It's social engineering in a way that this nation has never seen before in its history.
No.
The impacts are potentially devastating to our economy and to every man, woman, and child.
Not even was it this bad probably at the time of the colonies. When, I mean, they basically set themselves aside.
That's exactly
free.
right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Now, the problem with this, if you read Vice President Al Gore's book, Earth and the Balance, what you'll see many times repeated in that book is the call for making the Earth the central organizing principle of our society. And here is a United Nations document that actually visualizes that concept, where the Earth is the central organizing entity, and you have protected areas that we've been describing, biotechnology, ecological research around that as the most important activity that mankind can do. Those forestry activities, agricultural activities, and so forth that fit within those limits have the next importance. And then finally, our economy, human rights, property rights, land tenure, consumption and waste, even the human population itself has the least priority in this scheme. And we find that governance is therefore starting at the international level and works down towards the city, farm, village, forests, and grasslands where we as Americans live.
I see.
So we have a power structure that is from the top down, the international or global level down to the national, bioregional, and so forth. What this gives is basically all the decision-making power to this group of people right here. Perhaps at the United Nations level, they don't actually say the United Nations, but since it's a United Nations document, one would assume that, that that's what they're looking for.
Yeah.
And Madison, in framing the Constitution, basically defined tyranny as the accumulation of all power. And that's exactly what that model we just looked at does. It accumulates all powers in the hands of a few. Jefferson goes on to actually diagram this by saying that this is a diagram that Thomas Jefferson wrote or framed in using or framing the Constitution, where all power is in the ruling elite. This is what has existed in Europe in their control over the colonies at the time. Then there was a national, what powers are filtered down to the national level, then they decide how they want to filter it down to the community level, and finally the individual has the least power at all, of all. And Jefferson goes on to say that to break this, he knows of no safe depository of the ultimate powers, but of the people themselves. That we must have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And he developed another model, what he called the People's Law. And the People's Law basically have, the individuals have all the power.
Yes.
That they then give portions of it to the communities, cities, the city councils and so forth, to the county commissioners, to the many states, and finally the least power is within the federal government. Unless we go back to this type of structure, we are losing our freedoms. And every one of the officials in each one of these levels of government are responsible to the people that are within their jurisdiction.
From hell. But I believe that we now have in the U.S. Congress a treaty from hell, and I want to talk to you about it. Now, I want you to understand that our president has sent this treaty to Congress. In fact, I have a copy of this treaty. It's called the Convention on Biological Diversity. The Convention on Biological Diversity. Here's the message from the President of the United States as it went to Congress in 1993. Most nations of the world, and I believe the United States, will become signatories to this treaty from hell. And I'm going to show you very carefully that the United Nations Environmental Program has an agenda that will not only cause people to be massacred, millions to be massacred, to be slaughtered, bloodshed throughout the face of this earth, but that Christians will be horribly and horrendously persecuted throughout the face of planet Earth. And a new religion will come forth from this treaty, the religion of nature. For it is Satan who is God of nature. For the Apostle Paul warned of those who worship the creation rather than the Creator.
I feel betrayed. I feel like my government has come and just kicked me in the teeth for no reason.
They're using hundreds of thousands of tax dollars that could be better spent prosecuting real criminals like rapists, robbers, drug dealers. Instead, they're using our resources to go after people who are just making reasonable use of the property. It's ridiculous.
It's a difficult thing to contemplate, but environmentalism has become one of the greatest threats to personal liberties, to private property rights, to free enterprise that we have ever seen in this country.
All of a sudden, they arrested my father. Maybe 12 federal agents came, literally kidnapped him from his place of business. I get a call at work saying someone took your father, but it wasn't the regular police. It wasn't any agency we knew of.
We can either have the continuation of a free society, a society that operates under law, or a society gone berserk, where federal agents actually become the criminal element that destroys this country.
Earth Day 1970. The emergence of the organized environmental movement, the dawning of a green age in which environmentalism becomes a political and social force. In the following decades, the green movement becomes more organized, integrates into government, seizing control of environmental policies and governmental activism. The green movement becomes institutionalized. The results are that Congress and government agencies increasingly dictate lives with onerous and pervasive environmental regulations. These laws threaten America's free enterprise system. Under the guise of environmentalism, money and power are now concentrated. Ordinary people are fighting their government for control of their own property. Americans are jailed and private property is taken.
We've got now the weird experience of listening to David Lang, personal friend of I. Michael Sweetman, who is a superb elitist who says that the cannon fodder doesn't really need to get involved in this bank. Let's play that.
When the auditor finally gets his hands into the balance sheet. I suggest, therefore, that this be sold not through a democratic process. That would take too long and devour far too much of the funds to educate the cannon fodder, unfortunately, which populates the earth. We have to take almost an elitist program that we can see beyond our swollen bellies and look to the future in time frames and in results which are not easily understood or which can be, with intellectual honesty, be reduced down to some kind of simplistic definition. That
he is a viscount, a count from France, who's in charge of the world religion broadcast for the world. In our conversation, he said, "You people in America will know what the meaning of duty and sacrifice and service and discipline are." He said, "You will work and know God through your discipline and duty and sacrifice." He said, "You people in America are soft. You worry about your rights, rights, rights." He said, "You will see what it is like not to have rights very soon."